Okay. When you're thinking of the dreamscape is the perfect arena for your kind of archetypal figures. And again, there is a kind of a personal engagement or a personal relevance to the archetypal figures, but behind that there lies this kind of collective or more universal. And Jung was very keen to encourage us to find the myth in our own lives. So you find within any myth or fairy tale or any kind of sitting around the campfire, ancestors talking about earlier communities, there is very much a mythic or an archetypal component to those stories. So when we find our own archetypal kind of energies or our own archetypal figures, and we start to discuss and to discover the myth of our own lives, that can also be very revealing. And Jung was, again, was very keen to encourage us to learn to think symbolically and also to learn the language of symbols, because these opened out a tremendous reservoir of other angles on our lives. And when we begin to understand the symbolic content of our lives, everything becomes more meaningful. It's not so random, and it's not as kind of superficial as some people feel their lives are.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the big ones that I had at the very beginning of my shadow work was the dream of the water. There was always water in my dream, and how it within that dream of water, that's where I can lucid dream. That's the only, well, that's at the time, that was the only dream that I knew I was in a dream, and I would know to look at the water to decide how my future was going to be. And so if the water was rocky, I knew that there was going to be an emotional turmoil in my, because water is emotion. And if it was calm and if it was free flowing, so I'd always look at the symbol of the water in terms of kind of seeing, sort of prophesize my future. And the sea is a big symbol. It's a big sort of collective, universal symbol for emotions. And I find also that tarot has been so useful, because once you know that the symbols in tarot, you can decipher most dreams.
You can, yeah. And what's also interesting is with this collective unconscious layer, we can be presented with symbols that we have no personal awareness of, but because they are so relevant to other communities and other societies throughout time, they will present themselves to us. As a pure example of that, I had a dream once where there was a swan sitting on a wooden fence, but it had a snake head. And somebody said to me, "Have you ever heard of the plumed serpent?" And I had never heard of the plumed serpent. But of course, this is a massive, very important spiritual symbol for the Toltecs and the Aztecs and the Incas and all of those kind of Mesoamerican communities. And this was a perfectly realized symbol that I'd never consciously heard of, but by virtue of the fact that I have this collective unconscious layer, I've got access to this massive catalog and this massive library of symbols. And again, that became a turning point in my own kind of dream world interpretation, because I realized that it's not necessarily only the things I've encountered in my waking life that are included within my dreams. There can be so many other aspects to the dream world that are introduced effortlessly and perfectly, and those are also the archetypal things that we need to look for, not just what we would perhaps recognize as, the archetypal mother or the archetypal father.
Yeah, I had a very sort of prominent dream at the beginning of my shadow work, just before I started the course there. a few weeks before the actual start date at the course on psychology with art therapy, and this was the beginning of my shadow work. You know, I'd kind of been through a bit of the dark night of the soul already, but I didn't really know much about. I didn't know much about shadow work. I wasn't kind of embarking on this journey, and I knew very little bit about alchemy. I'd seen a few documentaries. It kind of triggered my interest, but I didn't know really. I couldn't talk about it. But just a few weeks before the course started, I had this dream, and I lay in sort of the fetal position. I didn't have a fever, but I felt feverish. I was kind of hot, cold, kind of mostly hot. I had this kind of like burning sensation, like my skin was black, I was black, okay, and I was in between the state of sleep and dream throughout this state for 4 hours. So I lay in this sort of fetal position for 4 hours, and I felt I was black, and I wasn't quite asleep, and I wasn't quite awake, and I had this fever, and I had this this very numinous thing. It was like pleasure, pain at the same time. It was like I was burning, crispy, smouldering. You know, I was ash, and I had this light inside of me, and it was coming out of my mouth, my eyes, my nose, my ears, and I was in the sky. Okay, so and I felt this, you know, and for the few weeks afterwards, I felt black. Is the only way. It's not like I felt like a black person. It's not that. I felt the color black. And it was a very prominent dream, and it was only later on during the course, while our tutor was talking about alchemy, that I realized that this was a great symbol for like blackening, which is nigredo, which is the first stage of the alchemical process. And this kind of started the whole process. For it wasn't actually the first start. The reason why I took the course was a completely other dream, in which I saw a mandala on the floor. And I associated it with a documentary I'd recently seen about Carl Jung and his mandalas. And I was thinking about two different courses. One was the Carl Jung course, and one was another much cheaper course. And we didn't have much money at the time, but I knew from that dream, and I had never done anything because of a dream before. That was the first time, but I knew I had to do that course because of that dream. For me, it was a sign, and it was a symbol, and I'm so glad, because you know, I wouldn't be here today. Probably I wouldn't be doing this today. I wouldn't have been able to have looked at my shadow in the way that I have. So yeah, I mean, sometimes there's just a bit of magic. There's something that happens from outside. And you know, because we have access to these collective universal symbols, they come up, and if we pay attention, they can be life-changing.
Absolutely.
And I think Carl Jung did also say that, you know, the dream always tells you something you don't consciously know, and the psyche is always working towards individuation. So it's always kind of prompting you in terms of your dreams, your visions, your fantasy, your daydreams, your synchronicities. And so by paying attention to all of those things, you know, you can start to see symbols, and you start an interaction with the unseen world. And then there is this other quote that when you start to notice the unseen starts to notice you. And this is where the magic starts to fucking happen. And, you know, everything starts to sort of roll from there. Unfortunately, I don't think it doesn't last forever, though. I don't think that magic doesn't last forever.
No. Marie-Louise von France said that maybe you have to accept that there is a mysterious power in the universe with which you have to come to terms. And that mysterious power is this incredible ability of the archetypal energies to present the most perfect way forward. And if we learn to listen to those prompts, because the psyche strives to balance itself, and also the idea of compensation, and also giving us alternative ways forward. So if we are canny enough and we spend enough time with the dream world, it's the most incredible resource. It really, really is. And most people neglect it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I often get people on the group, on the Facebook group, saying, you know, I've tried shadow work and nothing seems to be happening. It's like, it's very simple. Shadow work is very, very simple, but it involves taking time and to be on your own, and to start to look at those symbols in your dreams, and to notice the visions, fantasies, and all those, and the daydreams, and your behavior, and where it comes from, and looking for the roots of them, you know, and to analyze your childhood, you know, the parenting you received in childhood, and looking at your fears, you know, so all of those things. But the dreams are always, you know, that they are our sort of guiding, that they're our guide. They are the
They
psychopomp
really are.
between us and, you know, our conscious and our unconscious.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that's interesting when you begin to look at your dreams is how your complexes are also played out within the dreamscape. And when you're thinking of a complex, the complex can be a personal one, and there can be quite a lot of awareness around that kind of complex, this feeling toned idea. Just a moment. When you've got a personal complex, of course, this feeling toned idea is not just one idea. There's like every time we interact with something, we build up another layer of experience or another layer of feeling around that subject. But when you have an archetypal kind of core, then the complex becomes kind of bigger than ourselves. And the complex is kind of almost an independent little piece of our consciousness that has its own life. And you often find that the complex will overwhelm consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So when the complex is constellated, all you can think about is how angry you are, or how frightened you are, or how insanely jealous you are, or this incandescent rage that completely drives. And we're almost not ourselves. And that's because this is a independent piece of awareness that is centered around a particular subject or a particular archetype. And the best thing we can do is to develop this conscious attitude to them. Because when they become very problematic, especially when we start to work with our shadows, we begin to understand, oh my God, we all have complexes, and they're not necessarily a bad thing, because they can be very revealing and very useful and very helpful, and they can guide us. But when they tend to dominate behavior and drive us in ways that we don't necessarily want or need, that's when the shadow work really begins to become very evident. I need to do something about this.
Yeah, the complex is like it just completely dominates, doesn't it? It just completely takes over. And I always, I mean, from my own experience and from what I've read, that also the complex is the roots of the complex. There's usually a trauma behind it. There's usually something, that there's and then so like the trauma, then we start to kind of associate things like that situation into the trauma. For example, and I've said this before, anyone who's kind of seen a few of my different videos, but one of the complexes that I had, which led me on to that course, was that I needed to kind of I needed to face a fear, and one of my fears was going into a classroom, and one of my biggest fears was sitting around a round table or in a circle. And at the time I didn't really know why. I hadn't really given any thought to it. I just knew that I didn't like going into schools or classrooms. that was, and so I knew I needed to face that. And it was only over time that I realized this whole thing about sitting at a round table, I would just become really into myself and like not want to converse, and in fact sometimes not be able to say anything because I'd feel or maybe even have a panic attack. Because of this situation. And it was only through the shadow work that I realized, and I went back into the roots of why did I feel that way about these certain situations that I had avoided all of my life, because throughout life, if you're not conscious of anything of yourself, if you don't know yourself, you will just kind of avoid situations that you find difficult. And then you end up not meeting your potential, not reaching your potential. So I learned through that course and through sort of facing my fears, and also letting the panic attack happen. Just allowing it to happen. What's the worst that can happen? Everyone's going to know, oh God, it's embarrassing. And once you kind of go through that, it's almost like you face your demons and you kind of overthrow them, and it gives you something. It gives you some kind of a sense of I don't know, some kind of strength that you didn't have before. And I remember one of the ladies who came in to us, her name was Benig Moore, and she said she said she talks a lot about psychology within in the fetus, in the fetus and mother kind of situation. But she did say something that really got to me. She said that a child who wasn't loved well enough by their father will present as having no backbone. And I thought, you're a fucking bitch. That's what I thought. That's what I thought. And so, like, that reaction, I had to to analyze that reaction. But that was the reaction that she got from me. I mean, I didn't say it, obviously, I was very polite, but it was in my mind. But yeah, so I guess, and that's what happens when you start to meet your complexes, is that you get that feeling of you kind of building yourself back up again from
Yes.
what you could have been.
And also, perhaps in this particular instance, when you're sitting around a table, perhaps it's the communicative aspect as well, communicating to 10 or 15 people rather than one-to-one. So it becomes very much more about, say, it's the larger element to communication that may have been slightly more intimidating for you, because you're an extremely effective communicator. It might just have been, in terms of your complex, that the complex was limiting how many people you were able to communicate with effectively.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's how they work, is they do tailor, and they do prevent, and they do hold us back from fuller or more powerful expressions of what we want to do or what we want to say.
Yeah, I mean, and one good way to sort of identify complex is just to look at your fears, your anxieties, the things that you avoid. It's very simple. The things that that make you panic. Yeah, and I guess also for me, because I've always had a fairly different sort of perspective, and until quite recently, I didn't really express it to too many people. Definitely not like sort of publicly like I am now. There was always, I guess, that fear that when you don't know yourself and you're not sort of strong enough in your own sort of convictions and who you are, you look for the approval of other people. And so if you find yourself with a different perspective to the I guess the mainstream, then you're always going to be sort of frowned upon. Or they just go, she's crazy.
It's par for the course. Any thinking person finds themselves outside of the mainstream. Any thinking person who dares to question will unfortunately encounter that kind of reprobation and disapproval. And if we are dominated by this kind of complex where we need other people's approval so much, then that complex will essentially strangle all vital energies, and we will just be a people pleaser. And the complex, when it's kind of sufficiently ingrained, it does become unconscious. And as you were saying, we do not realize that we are behaving in these ways according to our complex. But it's not a free choice. We're not deciding. It's the complex which is driving what we are doing. And you often find within the complex there is this archetypal core. So is it the kind of the abandoned child? Is it the orphan? Is it the what is driving or what is creating the conditions for that complex to flourish? And again, it's developing that conscious attitude towards the complex, which allows us to see what it is doing and how it is, in a sense, controlling us. And once we understand that, we are then able to say, right, I'm still there. This complex is perhaps not as effectively or as powerfully constellated. I'm more in control of it. So as an example of that, the other day, I've got a complex around people treating me like an idiot.
I think most people have.
I can't stand it. And I was talking to someone the other day, and I had this flash of rage, instantaneous flash. And I was able to say, oh, this is a complex, this has been constellated, but I'm not allowing it to influence my behavior. Even though I was feeling it, I was aware of it, and I was able to not necessarily control the rage, but I was able to control how I responded to that rage. Whereas if the complex had been completely unconscious, then I would have been effing and blinding. Rah, 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 rah. So there is something to be said for working to make these complexes more conscious, definitely.
Most definitely. The idea of that, you know, I mean, I'd say that that's also, your response was legitimate. You know, like the rage that you felt was legitimate. And so, I mean, I wonder, you know, although like I kind of, this is where I kind of question as well. Like we say that we know to understand, you know, that this is a complex and that we're not going to maybe react. We're going to kind of be sort of controlled in that. But then there's also, you know, being true to ourselves and maybe kind of, I don't know, maybe discussing and saying, do you know what, that really annoys me, that you think that I'm, you know, an idiot, or that you're treating me this way. I just wonder, I mean, I'm not sure what I'm saying actually, but there is some aspect to that which is that, you know, that is legitimate, you know, and that it kind of does also seek expression, you know, that reaction. And I guess it probably has its roots in some other kind of archetype, like you said, some other maybe, you know, something to do with, you know, childhood, you know, not being heard, or being thought of in the way that you're not, or being misrepresented perhaps.
Yeah. And you do find there is this historical kind of aspect to complexes. They're not new, you know, they've had many years where they've built up their layers of association and their feeling turned ideas. So in this particular instance, I understood that my complex was very much about child, very much about the child being ignored or humiliated, or you know, the complex can have so many different elements to it. So it's not necessarily, and it's say inferiority complex. Inferiority complex is not a single plank. That's why this term complex, it is very complicated, and there are so many other, all of our complexes are connected. So you may move through one to reach the next, So in those kind of instances, I may have been going through 3 or 4 different complexes to reach that moment of rage. And what I really appreciated about this particular instance was I was able to say, I am very angry. I just wanted to get away from that situation at that time, but I wasn't shouting, screaming, I wasn't breaking stuff, I wasn't the temptation to beat someone up. None of that was there. I was able to really control it, and also to channel it, and also make it known to this particular person that, my God, I want to throttle you, but I'm not going to. You know, whereas before that complex would have driven behavior and it would have been very unpleasant. So when you get to that point, the archetypal core becomes very much about, well, what is it? Who is complaining, or who is feeling that? Not me as an adult, me as the child.
Yeah. I remember one, I don't know if I remember this correctly, is it Jordan Peterson? You've heard of him? Jordan Peterson. Yes. He's a great psychologist. He said something like, a good man is a dangerous man who can control himself.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what you
Definitely.
are, David.
Thank you.
So, should we talk about ego? Because very often the ego gets like a bit of a bum deal, especially within like the New Age community. They're always talking about sort of like death to the ego. You'll be you know, if you can kill your ego, then you will not suffer anymore. You know, that is kind of the way forward. But the ego is a very important part of our personality and our makeup. Do you want to discuss a bit about the ego?
The ego is the ego is complex because it's feeling turned ideas around a particular theme. So the ego kind of works within the field of consciousness. And it's the ego which allows us to have a sense of self. And the ego, again, will be constrained by, it has a certain amount of freedom, but will be constrained by complexes and archetypal kind of force fields. But the ego this idea that the ego is bad is absolute nonsense. And I think the ego is very much misunderstood because it's not about me, it's about a sense of self. It's that ability to have the awareness of who we are. And then, of course, the ego becomes compartmentalized, and we can put the ego into different personas, and we can, in a sense, manipulate the presentation of the ego, the presentation of awareness. But at the same time, the ego is very much about, I'm aware of what's going on around me, and I'm very much more aware of how I'm reacting or responding to others. But the ego is not really just only me. The ego is that awareness of self plus others. It's the tool that allows us to work on the physical plane and also maybe even on other planes.
I guess, like with anything, there, you know, there are dualistic aspects to the ego. I mean, I guess for anyone who is sort of unaware, that doesn't know themselves, that isn't into sort of shadow work or introspection and all this kind of stuff, and doesn't really know much about psychology, then the ego, this sense of I am, can also be very defensive. It can build up this sort of persona of, this is me, I am a wife, or I am a teacher, or I'm, you know, this kind of persona that I identify with, and nothing's going to break my illusion. And I guess it's, you know, when you're sort of unconscious of, you know, really who you are and how things really work, I guess psychologically, you know, that's where the ego can be sort of not so much your best friend, but just like a defense mechanism for who I am this, and not want to kind of go anywhere else.
And this idea of people having ego, that's this process of inflation, which is this very evident and very unpleasant increase in self-conceit. So you find people strutting the stage and puffing out their feathers, and that has this kind of moniker of ego, but it's not really true ego. It's really more about the kind of inflated sense of self rather than the true sense of self. And this idea of an ego-self axis, I think, is very interesting as well, because we all suffer through our lives, and we all have kind of painful, terrible experiences, but that ego-self axis needs to be maintained in some kind of order, because ultimately the ego is not the self. The ego is a part of the self, and a lot of people would mistake the ego as being the self. But if you have this ego and self axis, you're able to move back towards the self and understand that the ego is purely a tool or an aspect of total consciousness.
This is it, because sorry, go on.
You find that the ego self-axis will be damaged throughout life, unfortunately, but as long as we have some sense of it and we can maintain that connection to the self, rather than to assume, okay, this is my ego, this is me, this is the self, and then we lose the self.
Well, I mean, the self, and the way that I understand it is, the self is always there in the background. The self is the totality of the whole personality, including the ego, the shadow, the animus, everything. It is, for me, it's like the absolutely genuine, authentic who we really are, underneath all of the social and cultural conditioning, all of the, you know, all the lies that we, you know, our persona that we've chosen to kind of wear in this society. And so that when the ego becomes conscious of itself and these various different aspects, it becomes like the bridge, doesn't it? Or the bridge, or is that the anima and animus also become the bridge between consciousness and unconscious? But anyway, when you open it up, when you then the ego becomes a friend to the self, or at least maybe it backs down, and it sort of allows for the authentic, what is authentic in the person, to really come out. So that the persona kind of maybe dies down, or maybe takes a new path, maybe which more represents the authentic version of the person, of the self, and the ego allows that. It's a bit of a defeat for the ego, is what I've sort of read and how I understand it.
Yeah. And this preciousness around the ego, that's probably where death to the ego comes in, but it's not really what I would understand ego per se to be.
Mhm.
And the idea of the self, I think it was James Hillman.
Woman, yeah.
He was one of those post-Jungians. He postulated that the self is actually the organizing principle. So it's the self which allows us to pull everything together and to create this overview. And then the self will recognize animus anima, persona, ego, shadow, but the self stands behind and pulls everything into some kind of shape.
Mhm. Now, I'm sure if we talk a little bit about the idea about ego death. Do you know much about this ego death? Sorry.
You tell me what you know.
So, well, I experienced something that I can only describe as ego death once at the very beginning of my sort of shadow work, just before the course started, where I was kind of experiencing kind of Kundalini.
Mm-hmm.
For a good year or so beforehand,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember this one night in particular that my dog. I was sitting in the living room with 3 dogs and my daughter, and the dogs all started growling at me because I could feel the energy of Kundalini rising inside of me, and the dogs, my lovely dogs that I don't usually growl at me, started growling, so they could feel it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I went into the spare room that night, and I remember feeling like parts of me had gone missing, and there was a part of me up on the ceiling, and I know it sounds crazy, but there's a part of me in the ceiling, and it was my ego. It was a part of me that related to the outside world, and I was kind of scared that I was losing that. And so I had this whole night of this very sort of feverish, strange sort of night of confrontation with the unconscious, where I kind of felt that I didn't want to lose this part of me that was somehow kind of disjointed. And I can't really say, that I did anything in particular to stop it, or that, what happened, but I felt that a part of me was dying. And so with that death was a fear, and I was scared of kind of losing that part of myself. But then in that process also, for the weeks and so months afterwards, what was emerging was that although I had this strange sort of inner death that one time, this new sort of perspective was sort of transpiring. And so, I always say I'm not scared of death because I already died.
Yeah.
And it's true. I'm really, when it comes, I'm whenever, but I'm not
Yeah.
scared in the same way that I think a lot of people usually are. So yeah, ego death. So I wonder if that's an experience that have you had anything like that on your sort of journey?
Yeah. Carlos Castaneda talks about this process as well. And he worked, of course, with Don Juan for many years. A lot of people say this is crap, it was all invented. But nevertheless, the character works with this shaman, Don Juan, and he goes through this process as well. And he's very worried about it. And there's a moment when he's walking along a street and he looks up at the sky and suddenly he's swept away. He's actually no longer in his body.
Mm-hmm.
He's up in the clouds and he's kind of torn loose from any sense of self or any sense of being on the physical plane. And Don Juan was talking about how it is quite dangerous because it is a kind of a loss of identity, or it's a loss of awareness, or it's a loss of self. And you do find that when you're in those positions where you are losing that sense of yourself, it may feel like death, but it's not really a death, but it's that disconnect between ego and self. And the self is seeing the ego as a kind of external entity.
Yeah, that's
Does that make
exactly
any sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it's nice to hear stories like that because I don't feel so crazy.
No, and it is
People.
it is something which not everyone. You do find people, say, who have breakdowns or who have psychotic episodes or who have really traumatic responses to terrible events in their lives. They also have that sense of disconnect where the ego becomes something alien and foreign. and the ego is not able to process the huge volume of emotion and information that is required. So it disconnects, and things are experienced at a distance, and it's almost as if we are looking at ourselves as somebody else, or we're looking at ourselves across a room. We are disembodied.
Disembodied, yeah. Oh my God, that's one of my drawings was called Disembodied. I remember like the body and the face, and I mean, that's one way. So we can talk maybe a small bit about art now, maybe, that, you know, throughout my process, actually, that the art was something that I hadn't done for 20 odd years. And so suddenly to kind of start to make lots of art, and the art was sort of talking to me. It was telling me things. And I think that you probably experienced the same thing during during the course as well, and maybe before and after, I don't know. How has art been a big player for you? Has it been a big player for you in your sort of process?
Huge. I've done a lot of art with others, and a lot of my art's been collaborative. And you find that you get this kind of shared psychic space, and you get this transformative field, which is generated by the fusion of different psyches working together. And then art becomes that kind of bridge or that portal into this kind of sacred space where the most astonishing things emerge, and nothing is extraneous, nothing is random. Everything within an image has some meaning or some point, and even something really tiny may not necessarily, you can overlook certain things. And of course, when you're thinking of color value, shape, when you're looking at a series of images, when you're looking at thematic concerns, is there a sudden break in style? Do certain shapes and do certain motifs reoccur again and again and again across a series of images? The image is amazing, and it becomes a kind of a map, a comic book of the psyche.
And then also there's the associations to archetypes, mythological motifs, religious motifs as well, which can also be very telling in what's really happening in the unconscious.
Yeah.
And I mean, I found through kind of using sort of symbols from my dreams, through my my life experience, by just using those things in my drawings, and then sort of elaborating in different ways. You know, I was surprised by what was coming out. I didn't go into any drawing with too much of what I wanted it to be, and a lot of the time I'd start one thing and it would turn into something completely different. You know, a flower that I'd seen in my previous image, I did again, turned into a whole bloody owl. You know, in fact, I'll put that on the group actually. I haven't put that on. And within that, every feather had a different picture. You know, there was a different scene in every, you know, and one of them was someone from the course, and one of them was a scene that you know, from a dream, and one was a tarot card, and like you said, they're not random. Within that, there is so much. There's so much information. If you know, if you're willing to really sort of engage with the psyche, it's all there. You just need to allow time and space to express it. Yeah, go on.
The other thing that I would say when working with images, I mean, your images were magnificent, and they had a very high aesthetic value. But I often say to people, when you're working with images, the persuasive power of beauty and this kind of prompt for aesthetic value, you don't necessarily, it's perfectly okay to have the messiest, craziest, real kind of mud on your page. The image doesn't have to be pretty all the time. And you often find when people are working with images, they want them to look good, they want them to be pretty, they want them to have this aesthetic value. And if you're working with art therapy images, if you're working with the unconscious, then you can throw all that away, because there's no imperative to be pretty all the time, because the psyche is not.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
I mean,
very succinct, right.
I remember working with this man once, and he started off doing this beautiful, very pretty rainbow, and then he added more, and then he added more. And then, you know, when you mix a lot of colors together, you get the kind of muddy brown. And he added more, and the beautiful, lovely rainbow image had vanished to be replaced by this muddy brown, and he added more and he added more, and ultimately it ended up looking like a page smeared with baby shit.
Oh, God. Well, there's a huge sort of archetypal value in that, isn't there?
And that's the idea, is that it was really what started out as something very controlled and very pretty. Ultimately, the true energetic value of the image emerged, and it just became this muddy, crazy, messed up nothingness, which spoke volumes.
Yeah, well, this is it. This is like the destructive process is so important. And as you know, I've been working with kids for a long time, almost 20 years now. And I always say that within children's play, you know, that destruction is as important. You know, it's such an important part of play, and they need it, and we need it. We still need to destruct things. And so in the process of art making, you know, I know what you're saying. We do want to make things that are pretty and want other people to say how much they like them. That goes to show how much we need other people's approval. But actually, if you're kind of working from what's coming out inside of you, the need to destruct, you know, it only leads to a rebirth. And so it's an important process.
Yeah.
My brother is also an artist, and he did this huge painting, absolutely huge painting, very close up of this beautiful woman with no hair, and it was all kind of eyes and lips, and she was just, and then the black background, and she was kind of smeared with her kind of colours all over. She was just beautiful. And a few months later, he'd got a black marker and put glasses on her and a dick on her head. It's like, and so like this image of perfection that he'd created, suddenly he turned, you know, he wanted to destroy it, and he did it with a few paintings. It's really funny to see. It doesn't take away from the beauty, but it just shows what's inside, you know.
Yeah. And that kind of graffiti element, you know, the defacing of something can also be very interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. Right. So listen, I think we've covered most of the subjects, but it's been great speaking to you, David, and we must do it again. We choose
thank you.
Next time. So listen, I'll speak to you another time. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Carolina. All the best, and we'll speak again.
Thank you, David.